Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Ferrari have turned up to Monza and immediately look like a serious threat this weekend, but they will not be the only threat to McLaren. Both Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc spent some time at the top of the timesheet today, but Max Verstappen's Red Bull was also pretty competitive as well. Is it a serious threat to McLaren over the next couple of days? Is it true that Ferrari were doing glory runs, or has their new rear wing actually made a substantial impact on their performance? Very much into your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. We learned rather a lot on the Friday, and we're going to get into it. Starting here, the Monaco Grand Prix has been extended to at least 2035. It wasn't that long ago we were talking about whether Monaco would even stay on the calendar. F1 have done the Las Vegas Grand Prix. That's kind of like their new Monaco, but Monaco's always been there and it will stay for some time. They're going to make some changes, probably not to the track anytime soon, but they mandated the two-stop as we know, and potentially other changes in due course. But look, Monaco and F1, as much as the Sunday isn't always the best time, it does go hand in hand, and this was already extended until 2031, I think, and now they have gone 4 years further than that. Williams, they've officially launched a right of review request, whatever, to the FIA about Sainz's penalty at the Dutch Grand Prix. Many, including myself, would say that yes, Sainz had no right to that corner. He was not ahead on the entry, he was not ahead on the mid-corner either. Now, if Lawson closes the gap, then Sainz had, he had to get out the way, but equally Lawson, knowing there was a car on the outside, shouldn't just be able to close the gap without any consequences either. Now, I think it was a racing incident. I think the fault of that incident was on both drivers, but Sainz was given a penalty, and that sets a concerning precedent when it comes to drivers. If they know that they were ahead, then they have absolutely no need to give any space at all to the other car, because they can just run them out of road, and they know that if there is contact and that guy does try and hold it around the outside, he's the one who's going to end up with the penalty. So that's what Williams said. It's important for us to understand how we go racing. They don't feel like the penalty was fair, and I think that's probably justified. But Lawson has a slightly different opinion. He wasn't very happy with the way that Sainz, basically what Sainz said on the radio, right, about, oh, it's always this guy. So look, Lawson is not shying away from making a few more enemies. Now, Danny Rick, there were rumours he was going to be back in the car potentially with Cadillac in Formula 1. They threw his name around, of course. Ford announced their new kind of change in their naming, basically, of a couple of things. And Ricciardo is now officially a Ford Global Ambassador, but he's confirmed at the same time that he doesn't intend to come back to racing. This has been known, but it was talked about, could he come back? Drivers the likes of Jenson Button, among many others, have come back and done other things in racing. Would I expect Ricciardo to never step in a car again competitively? I think there's a good chance these former F1 drivers will go and, race something here and there, but it's probably, for Danny Rick, not going to be anything especially serious. That's certainly what he says. Coming back to Formula 1 is totally off the cards for the Australian. 2026, we've got some new engine regulations. Beyond that, we don't really know what they're going to do, especially when the next engine regulations are going to come in. We talked about it over the last few days. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but just there was meant to be a meeting next week where the teams were going to talk about this. What's happening next? What are we going to do with these engines? Can we agree on a V8, naturally aspirated, whatever? But that has now been cancelled. So you're going to push that back, and it's fair enough. It's not exactly necessary to decide right now, but the point is that the suppliers are still very much divided on what they really want to see. Now, Norris, he needs a big weekend. He arguably needs to win this weekend to try and keep the championship alive. But his engine gave up last week. It wasn't his engine's fault. It was a chassis integration issue. McLaren confirmed it was an oil leak. The engine shut itself off. And now that engine is back at Mercedes for them to check it over to make sure that it's good to be run again. This is quite important for Lando, right? Because if he's forced to take a 10-place penalty for another power unit, one more than Oscar requires, that's another issue for Norris in terms of, let's say closing up the championship fight. He would likely take it at a race, maybe something like Austin, where it's more possible to make a comeback through the field, but nonetheless, he needs it to be okay, I think, if he wants a good chance of keeping the championship alive. Now, this was some great drama today, and very entertaining as always, from Sergio Perez's father. So Perez is back on the grid, and with a Formula 1 contract now in hand, Antonio Perez, he's at it again, right? He's talking to the media about anyone that will listen. And even when he was Perez at Red Bull, Antonio was pretty critical of Red Bull. Nowadays, that's gone next level, right? Now, like, he is his father, so you've got to expect it. I'm not going to criticize it too heavily, but I just find it pretty funny. So, Perez's father, again, it's the same comment about, like, oh, he didn't have the same car. Like, some buy into this, some don't. But Perez says, Sergio Perez's father, Perez, says, if Checo had the same car, he would now be a world champion, which is quite the statement to say not only was the car like not the same, but also if he had the same car, he wouldn't have just been closer to Max, he would actually have beaten him. So I don't know about that. And he also said Checo drove for Red Bull for 4 years. How many years did Red Bull win the championship? 4 years. Now, to his credit, for Antonio's perspective, he has identified a correlation, right? Because yes, this is true. Does it tell the whole story of Perez? If Perez was there this year, would they have won the championship? No, but Antonio says Checo Perez made Verstappen champion, which is quite the comment. And he actually went on to say a couple of other things as well. And, well, I think that was pretty much it. Jos Verstappen gave his response. The original Dutch is quite funny, right? Just like Dutch is a hilarious language. This first part is especially comedy because this translates to what an idiot that guy is. He's always been given the same material, the same car, but just needs to step on the gas. So, yeah, Jos is being pretty clear to say, I don't know what this guy's on about, but look, with Sergio back on the grid, it means that his father, Papa Perez, is also back on the grid as well. So it's going to create some entertainment. There was also some talk about Max. Could he go to another team? Obviously, the answer is yes, but which one? Mercedes seems the most likely, but who knows about Aston Martin, the Honda relationship there, the Adrian Newey factor could be a serious deal as well. But there were some rumours that potentially, and I think Jos Verstappen said that he's spoken with Max, not to these teams, but he's spoken with Max about, well, what team could we join? Probably not McLaren right now because Piastri and obviously Norris shouldn't be going anywhere, but you never really know how that relationship transpires in the coming years. Ferrari, Hamilton's probably got another year or two, a couple of years left, so maybe that's an option, and therefore it was thrown around to Max to think, well, in the next couple of years, maybe there could be a Ferrari seat, maybe Charles Leclerc decides enough's enough, I don't know. But Max said they've got 2 drivers contracted, so there's no discussion, but is there a chance? Then yeah, there's lots of chances to make a decision, but Max also clarified in another comment that he would only go to Ferrari if he was convinced he could win, and that will depend on what happens next year, right? Like, if Ferrari are in a tough spot next year and the year beyond, then Max isn't going to go there just because it's Ferrari. So he made that point relatively clear. But speaking of Ferrari, Hamilton, unfortunately for him, has a 5-place grid penalty this weekend, which will affect his results tomorrow and obviously on the Sunday, you would think, unless there are, it's likely that Hamilton's going to need a safety car or something if he wants a chance of, winning the race or anything to that degree, just because he's going to be starting P6 absolute maximum, even if he sticks it on pole. Now, he did stick it on pole for FP1 today, and we'll get into that right about now. This was Alex Dunn in the McLaren, in Oscar Piastri's McLaren. And so Oscar Piastri only did 1 session today. We know that Piastri does like to ramp it up over the weekends, but today, certainly Piastri will need to show a bit more tomorrow, based on what we saw in FP2. Would I put it past him? Absolutely not. But it is true that Piastri, if Norris, let's say, does a great job, then it's not like Piastri can be 3/10 down, which is very unlikely that he will be. But, let's say Piastri's 3/10 off where Lando is this weekend. It's not like that's going to be good enough for P2 on the grids, right? That is likely, anyway, at the top end of the field, given the competition between these cars right now. We'll see it in a second. Not going to be good enough. So Piastri's going to need to have a better Saturday. I'm sure he'll have a better Saturday. Not like today was terrible, but we'll see the results in a second. But yeah, Alex Dunn back in the car. Pretty exciting stuff. He did get absolutely crowded in right here out of the second Lesmo. This is what Ferrari were playing around with. So they had a couple of rear wing options. There was this version that was flat to the bottom here, and then they had this other version which was an even bigger step down. So you guys can tell by the angle of the HP logo at the back that this top version is even more unloaded than the version at the bottom that they had some flow-vis on. So they were playing around with a couple of ideas here. We think that this top rear wing right here, they just homologated, they've just got it confirmed with the FIA over just the last few days because they really tried to get this special rear wing to arrive in time. They messed around with both, and it wasn't particularly clear that one was necessarily better than the other. this one will likely be better in qualifying because you tend to want to maximise your potential in qualifying, take off a bit more downforce. The issue is that it leaves the rear tyres more exposed during the Grand Prix, and that's something worth thinking about. But it is hard to overtake around Monza. Doesn't feel like it should be, but it is, just because of the nature of the track. No one's got any downforce. The final corner is very difficult to follow through, so it's difficult to, there's not much slipstream effect. The DRS effect isn't very big either. So qualifying is critical around Monza, and maybe Ferrari will lean that direction tomorrow. I'm sure that they will do, quite honestly. So yeah, they messed around with a few things, and you can see from another angle here what those rear wings actually looked like. What they'll do tomorrow, we'll see. There was also a very challenging day for the Mercedes drivers. This was George Russell pulling over before the Roger chicane, and yeah, he was out of the session. He had a hydraulics issue. The engine shut down to prevent itself from getting destroyed, but even as Toto said, he was like, yeah, lacking a bit in a straight line, wasn't really a great session. There was another red flag for Hadjar kicking up some gravel, and Chris Medland notes that Leclerc was actually noted for a red flag infringement because he overtook a Sauber, but he went to the stewards. Basically, they looked at it and they said that Leclerc had attempted to brake as much as he could. He just couldn't quite brake enough in time. But the result really of the day was what happened at the end of FP1, and that was both Ferraris in the top positions in Monza. You couldn't make it up. Hamilton, so Leclerc was topping the timesheet to 120.2. Hamilton then did a solid lap and, solid first sector, and the sector 2, sector 3 were the best of anyone. Purple to go 1.7 tenths clear of Charles Leclerc, and that stayed as the benchmark during the rest of FP1. So there was also a bit of drama, but just before we talk about some of the reaction to that from Gasly, we know that Carlos Sainz historically has, certainly on the current grid, he is one of the drivers who tends to impede other drivers the most, Canada 2023 among others. So Gasly was talking about that as well, and says it's always the same guy. So it was all going on today. One of the questions is with this result, because look at the times here, right? Hamilton 120.1, Leclerc 120.29, whatever, right to the top ends. Sainz was third in the Williams. We know that historically the Williams has gone well here at Monza. It used to go well here because it was just a straight line speed merchant. That's not quite so true anymore. The Williams is a more well-rounded car, but it still seems to be pretty good today in the hands of Sainz, and even Albon as well. Verstappen was fourth, but still 6 tenths down. Antonelli was fifth, 8 tenths down. Lando was sixth, 9 tenths down. So is the Ferrari just godlike, or did they put on a bit of a show for the fans? Right, this is one of the debates. It's a bit of a question right now just because of the margin here to say, and yeah, McLaren weren't really at the races in the first session, but I think a lot of that performance was legitimate, but are Ferrari tempted just to turn up the engine just a little bit more than their rivals to give the fans a nice send-off on the day one? Yeah, I think probably there was a little bit of that going on. But still, the top drivers. Hamilton tops the first practice session. Charles Leclerc in second. Carlos Sainz, former Ferrari man, in third. Italian driver Kimi Antonelli in fifth. There, of course, Max Verstappen, potential future Ferrari driver we discussed, up in fourth. So it was all going on, and these were the final results of that qualifying session. Not going to spend too much more time on this one because we've got plenty else to talk about. Now, the new downforce, or the new low drag rear wing that they were playing around with, they were pretty happy with it overall. As I say, we'll see what they actually decide to do for the next couple of days. Certainly tomorrow, of course, they will have to make a decision going into qualifying. It also seems that the suspension, we know, was a hugely important part of success in the last couple of years in this iteration of regulations. And it's also going to be relevant going forwards because while ground effect is, well, the Venturi tunnels are going away, it doesn't mean that ground effect won't still be a thing to some extent on the new cars. So suspension design is still going to be critical. Apparently Ferrari are making big progress there. They're extending their external hires in their suspension department, but and also making further top-level recruitment. So some interesting rumours going on that today. But then, speaking of Italian drivers, this was not ideal. 10 seconds, or 10 minutes actually, not 10 seconds, into FP2, Kimi Antonelli finds himself beached in the gravel. He lost the rear at the second Lesmo. He was on the hard tyres, and it's not like that Mercedes was looking good today, really, at all. But again, another incident, right? We saw it last week in Zandvoort, and to be fair, he bounced back relatively well from it, but he did beat himself in the gravel at Zandvoort. He crashed here last year, famously, but of course, that was a bigger crash than this one. But this still wasn't ideal, right? Would have scraped up the floor big time, caused a red flag, and he didn't get to complete the rest of the 50 minutes of the session. So definitely Antonelli's got to get on top of this. I know that people are roasting him bad after this one and, really piling the pressure on. And look, you're an F1 driver. You're going to get the pressure piled on. It's part of the nature. I do think Antonelli should still be fine. He's obviously had a very difficult European stint, but he does definitely need to learn that in the first, half of practice sessions, you just can't take too much risk, because otherwise you limit your own learning, you limit the learning of the team. And yeah, it's not the only driver that we saw lose it in these type of conditions. But Antonelli was out of the session as a result, which is particularly painful. And look, as I say, it's not just him, but Lando Norris had a big moment at the Roger chicane. He collected this one up and managed to save it. Hamilton was not having the best time in the second practice session. He was on the radio saying the power keeps dropping out, and they were trying to resolve that one. So the car wasn't as easy to drive in the second session. Ferrari probably messed around with a couple of things that didn't really seem to work for them. But then the McLarens did decide to turn up to the races. A 1:19.8 for Lando. Sainz wasn't far behind either. He put in a time that was about 3.5 tenths down on where Norris was. So that was pretty impressive, really. Another laps came flying through, but in the end it wasn't quite good enough to top Lando. Now this was Charles Leclerc in the gravel at the Oscar chicane. And definitely the Ferrari was more of a handful in the second practice session. There was a lot of incidents actually at the Oscar chicane keeping it on track here. Leclerc was struggling with it, and he was off track again right towards the end of the session as well. So yeah, the Ferrari wasn't exactly in prime position, but yeah, Leclerc put in a lap time that was about a tenth down. Sainz put a lap time that was also a tenth down after a couple of other attempts. Piastri was 2 tenths down, Hamilton 2 tenths down, Verstappen 2 tenths down, Albon 3 tenths down in 7th, and even Hülkenberg was there, and Tsunoda as well was only a couple of tenths further back than Max in 9th. So look at the times, right? That is a competitive session, and Lando Norris tops the timesheets, but it's got to be said that for tomorrow, qualifying is pretty all open. This I thought was notable. Hamilton, despite having a penalty, when he decided to do a practice start, he actually started from the pole position spot on the grid. I thought that was pretty interesting. But it's also very much worthy to note what the long run data looks like here, because if you look at these times, Max was in the mix, right? Max is 2 tenths down here. And if Max is 2 tenths down, you never know what he can do, right? If he pushes to the absolute limit. And Sainz is in the mix. The Williams looking pretty good. We know that sometimes they push it harder in qualifying than others do, or in practice than others do. Maybe also true for Ferrari, who knows? Both Ferraris, though, right in the mix. Hamilton a tenth off Leclerc this time. He was obviously a tenth and a half up on him in the first practice session. So again, Hamilton, Leclerc looking competitive in that Ferrari. But what's capable tomorrow is the big question. But then really what's capable of the Ferrari on the Sunday? Because if you look at the times, Norris was averaging a 1:23.6, Piastri was averaging a 1:24.0, about 3 tenths down on their long run pace. Verstappen was quicker than that. Verstappen was actually right in the mix, and Sainz was as well, and Albon wasn't far behind. So look, maybe there's something to be said about the Williams. More than likely, there's more left in these tanks for other teams than there is for Williams, but still, Verstappen is actually right in the hunt here. And yeah, we're going to talk about Ferrari. That's going to be on the thumbnail, I'd imagine, because that's the story at Monza. But don't count out Max this weekend. Now, the hard tyre run that Hamilton did was a 1:24.1. He did a lap towards the end that was actually a 1:23.5 or so. So, yeah, I think that was around about this lap right here. So, obviously, usual caveats, fuel loads and all this stuff you don't really know. So, tough to say. Maybe the hard tyre runs were obviously on a slower tyre, but also on higher fuel loads. You never really know. So, tough to say where Ferrari are in the long run pace. But I think we know that on one lap pace, they will be roughly in the mix you would think. And the McLaren's advantage should be mitigated here to an extent, right? I think on long run pace, they're still going to be deadly, but the McLaren, for various reasons, we believe it's also to do with the rear brake ducts that they have. They give them major advantages in tyre preservation, but they do cost them a bit more drag. And around Monza, drag is relevant. So they were pretty much the slowest cars on the straight here in practice 2, whereas the Saubers are actually the fastest. And the Ferraris weren't too far behind either, so in tweet your thoughts in the comments. Max was pretty positive about things. He came out of practice and said it was a reasonable Friday. Have you heard Max that positive in some time? Probably not. We seem a bit more competitive. competitive. I'm also very happy, he says, with the car. Helmut Marko even says, unless the McLarens suddenly come up with something, then yeah, he thinks a win for Max is possible. And Yuki was only a couple of tenths down as well, in a reasonably decent position. So excited to see how this one goes for the rest of the weekends. People are going to talk about Ferrari, but I think it's kind of all to play for with a number of the key protagonists. And Piastri was summoned for entering the fast lane before the session restart was confirmed. It was never going to be a penalty or anything for Piastri individually. In the end, it was just a reprimand for McLaren, so no real further action there. But tomorrow's a big day. Very much on Twitter your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.